Okay, welcome to the only full class period we have left before finals. So we have to make some changes on what we're doing. The schedule that I had before is not going to be the way we're going to be able to do it because of the changes and stuff. I mean, obviously, we were supposed to be doing the review on Tuesday. We weren't here at school. We were supposed to be doing the full chapter test today. So we're going to go and do a pop test. Just kidding. Okay. So what we're going to do today. Today we are going to do the chapter 4 review. Tomorrow, we're going to do a chapter 4 quiz, not a test. Okay? Just because we have no other time left, really. So the quiz is kind of a formative quiz. It's obviously going to go in your grade book. But the point of the quiz is to make sure you know what is going to be on the final exam. Okay? Because even though we haven't tested chapter 4, it is still part of the semester, and it is going to be on the semester exam. The chapter 4 test itself will happen in January when we've actually finished chapter 4. I was going to do a test part 1 and a test part 2. Now we're just going to do a quiz and then the full test. Okay? And so Monday we're going to do the review of the other 3 chapters. And then you'll have the exam. I think your exam is on Wednesday. Pretty sure 1 and 3 is on Wednesday. It's either Wednesday or Friday. Okay, but I'm pretty sure it's Wednesday. So, if we have a snow day, the test is still going to happen, okay? Because we're already doing the review of this section, and we may or may not get a review of the other sections, okay? So even if we had a snow day Friday and Monday, we're still going to have the final exam over the same material, okay? Which is the material we've already covered. Okay? So, let's start by talking about chapter 4, and we're going to kind of do an all-inclusive talk and walk through on the stuff we should know from chapter 4. Pause for a second. I wonder if my battery's low. If that's what's no to continue recording. Yes, that's right. There we go. Okay. So what we really, the real difference is we just didn't get to the CPU section this year. Okay. So things that we covered is the motherboard. And I want to go over that stuff mainly. Okay. So our motherboard is our main building block, and we talked about that when we first started this, right? When we get the motherboard determines our what? It starts with F. Okay, right. Our motherboard determines the form factor of our PC from there on out, okay? If the motherboard, and we said we're looking in our projects at ATX motherboards, if our motherboard is an ATX, whether it's mini, micro, standard, whatever, it determines the size and shape of everything else that follows. It talks, the form factor of the motherboard will determine what kind of socket we have. It will therefore determine what kind of CPU we can put in it. It will determine what kind of memory we can put in it, what kind of power supply we connect to it, what kind of case we have, okay? So the form factor determines the size and shape of everything else to come afterwards. Okay, and our motherboard is our main thing. We talked about back in chapter 1, if it's not connected to the motherboard, it's not part of the PC. Everything communicates through the motherboard, okay? It is the nervous system. Okay, it's not the brain, but it's the nervous system of the PC. And if it doesn't get a signal from the motherboard, it's not part of the PC. It's just something in a nice metal box real close to a PC. Okay? So the motherboard, besides determining the form factor, connects everything together, okay? Now, since everything connects through the motherboard has a very definite speed that things talk. And that's the speed of the bus, okay? And the bus of the motherboard, I'm going in my own way as I'm talking about this. If we remember our discussion, we've got a CPU here that we're going to say logically is in the middle of our motherboard, which we know it's not necessarily in the middle. And we have 2 buses, right? We have 2 bus routes. We have a north one and we have a south one.
Cool.
I'm in the middle of a class. Is this an emergency?
We have a testing emergency.
Okay, that's not an emergency. There's lots of other printers in the building. Sorry. I have one class left before finals. Please put in a work order.
I mean, this isn't like a regular class test. This is math testing.
You said a printing emergency.
No. I said a testing emergency.
Okay. So what? Okay, after the half an hour delay, let's get back to what we were talking about. So there are speeds to motherboards. In fact, the motherboard speed in many cases determines how fast your PC actually works. If I go and put a 3 gigahertz processor in that's working at that frequency as my CPU, but my processor is 10 times, or my motherboard speed is 10 times slower, it's going to slow everything that processor is able to do down, okay? So the motherboard has a speed. Now, first of all, we got a north and a south bus, and each one of those are controlled by a chipset. The chipset is its own processor that really doesn't do any computation. The chipset is responsible for the flow of information around the motherboard to and from that CPU. And I showed you motherboards before and showed you that there are heat sinks on motherboards, and usually the bigger heat sink that's integrated on the motherboard, like this one here, indicates that's where the Northbridge chipset is. The Northbridge chipset is doing a majority of the really fast stuff. Do we remember what's on the Northbridge or the North bus? There are two things that operate on the North bus. The two most important things that I said are usually right beside the CPU, when the closest things to the CPU. Memory. And video. Sorry, we're on a time crunch now since we just wasted half an hour of map testing. Okay, so my memory and my primary video are on that North chipset because it's what the CPU needs to talk to all the time, continually, in order to make this PC function. They're on their own bus route. Okay, they're on their own bus. Everything else exists on the South bus. Hard drives, CD-ROMs, network cards, sound cards, any other auxiliary things that I put in, everything that's integrated on this back panel, everything else communicates to the CPU through the South bus. Okay? Okay, so important things to remember: chipsets control the flow of information to and from parts of the PC back to the CPU, because everything has to come back to the CPU. Okay? Now, when we talk about the bus routes themselves, that's when we start to talk about the width of the bus. And what two bus widths do we have today? Our packets go around the bus in two different sizes.
64 and
32 and 64, okay? So the bus is either a 32-bit bus or a 64-bit bus, okay? 32 is still pretty much standard. Everything that we have here at National Trail, other than my PC and the servers, that PC and a PC over there is like 4 or 5 PCs that are 64-bit. Most of them are 32. Because all the drivers, and drivers are programs that make hardware work, all the drivers were originally written for a 32-bit. So if I want to make sure that all my stuff works, I'm usually safer going with 32-bit. All the drivers for all of our printers we have for 32-bit. I'm still finding the ones for 64-bit. Okay? It's newer. I haven't written them all. Okay? Now, 64-bit's been around for a while, but it hasn't been prevalent. Most people didn't use it. Most people use 32-bit, okay? Now, when it comes to the width of the bus, there's some things that, and reasons that you might choose 32 over 64. One of the reasons you might choose a 32-bit operating system, and let me say this, the OS, the operating system, and the hardware combined determine which bus you're going to use, okay? If you don't have a CPU and a motherboard that supports 64-bit, you're doing 32. Even if you do have a motherboard and a CPU that supports 64, you might still do 32 because of this, okay? Because of these drivers. Now, there are reasons we want to go to 64. One of the biggest reasons we want to go to 64-bit is because we break the 4 gigabit memory limit. Okay? If we are, I'm going to put a red line through there. If I can pick red, there's red. Okay? There is no 4 gigabit memory limit on 64-bit. On 32, there is a 4 gigabit memory limit. Meaning that if I take that laptop in front of you, and it supports 32 and 64-bit, okay? If I put 32-bit operating system, if I use Windows 7 32-bit, or in this case it's got Windows XP 32-bit, or Windows 8 32-bit, no matter how much memory I put in there, it's only going to see 4 gig, okay? If I've got 8 gig of memory in there, and I want to utilize it all, then I have to go to a 64-bit operating system. So at some point, I have to decide which way do I want to go. And both the operating system and the hardware determine that. Everything new supports 64-bit. You know, the new iPhone, it's the first mobile device, supported 64-bit. Everything before that was a 32-bit. But when it comes to PC hardware, you would be really, really, really hard-pressed to find something that didn't support 32 and 64-bit that's currently being made. You can find an old thing on eBay or whatever, but to find something that's currently being produced, it's going to support 32 and 64. So then it's going to be up to you and what operating system you install to determine which one you're going to use. Now, I will tell you that if you install 64-bit, it's a little bit more of a memory hog too, because it can be. Because usually you're putting on 64-bit because you got a lot of memory, so why wouldn't it use more memory? Okay? So if you've only got 2 gig of RAM, I wouldn't put a 64-bit operating system on there. Now, there are some other advantages. Because the strings are 64-bit long, big, huge, long strings of data traveling around the motherboard together, theoretically, if the motherboard goes at a certain pace, and you have all big buses versus all short buses driving around, that the information gets around faster. However, it doesn't add packets together. The packets kind of go. However, there are some things that are big. Okay, video files can have some very big, long strings to them. In which case, when it comes to really high-intensive video games, really high-intensive use of graphics stuff, a 64-bit machine may seem noticeably faster and better, okay, than a 32-bit machine. So there are some handoffs. When I use it, do you see the difference? Probably not, unless all of a sudden I can't get to Trail 3 printers because they don't work. All the multi-point systems, by the way, are 64-bit. So that whole 213 lab, all 64-bit, all those little multi-point systems in 210, they're all 64-bit because those are servers that are running this, okay? And you couldn't put 4 gig of RAM in there and say, hey, it's going to run 28 machines. You need to put a lot more RAM in there to run all 20 of those machines in 213. So I had to install special drivers to get to the same printer over in Ms. Tinsman's room. So there's some reasons to do 32 versus 64, but you need to realize that it's a hardware and a software issue. Okay, both of them go together. And this driver issue is one of the things that really pushes what decision you want to make. If you've got an old printer and an old scanner, and you put a 64-bit one operating system on, you may all of a sudden not be able to use that scanner anymore. Okay, which is what we're having. Even with Windows 7, the drivers for Windows 7 are decidedly different than the drivers for Windows XP, and they're not compatible. If I write a driver for this part of this piece of hardware in XP, it does not work in Windows 7. So that's another consideration when you upgrade operating systems. is all my stuff going to work, or the drivers for all my stuff. Okay, so let's get back to our conversation since I stepped off the path here. When I look at my motherboard, there are some things that, first of all, I should be able to identify readily and easily, okay? I should be able to identify the CPU socket without a question on any CPU that I give you, okay? On any one. I should be able to identify that it's ATX because it goes integrated components, CPU, memory. And all ATX boards comply with that design, and all of the expansion slots are down next to it. And my biggest memory one, now this is an older one actually, my biggest video should be right next to the CPU, and usually the CPU slot is going to be down a little closer because the CPU wants to be in the middle of this kind of ring of information going around right here. Okay, let me see if I get a newer picture. There's a little newer one. Okay, and actually it's not that much newer. Again, I've got my memory here, my CPU, my integrated components, my expansion slots. I should be able to readily identify those things when I look at a motherboard, okay? Here's the newer one. How do I know, now this says right here, the socket AM2 connector. How do I know from just looking at that that's probably for an AMD? Just from looking at that motherboard, how do I know it's probably for an AMD CPU? Because of socket. And what kind of socket is it?
Not LGA.
Not LGA, okay. So LGA is really for what? CPU, that's really for Intel. And if it's not LGA, it's not LGA, it's PGA, right? It's PGA, and PGA sockets are mainly for AMD processors anymore. Now there are some exceptions, but in general, that's the rule. LGA stands for Land Grid Array. PGA stands for what's the GA stand for? Grid array. And what's the difference between an LGA socket and a PGA socket? A PGA socket has
It's not the little
PGA has little
points.
also
Pins.
called pins. There we go. It stands for
Pins.
pin grid array. Oh, that's just amazingly straightforward sometimes on some of those acronyms. Okay, so a pin grid array uses pins and it has holes, and that denotes that it's an AMD processor. A land grid array is flat and it has no pins. It has those little dots on it, and those are mainly for Intel. And there is at least one or two exceptions to the rule, but in general, that's the rule. So if I was to look at this one, I showed you this picture with nothing around the outside, and I said, most likely, what CPU manufacturer does this motherboard go for? You would say AMD, which stands for? Oh, I'm going to tell you. You should know! Oh, man, Advanced Micro Devices, okay? Advanced Micro Devices. We'll learn more about those when we start the next section of Chapter 4, which is specifically about CPU, okay? So we've got these back panel connectors. We've got our CPU socket in here that's a PGA. We've got our memory, and in this case where we've got our expansion slots, we have the first one here is a PCI X16 that's made specifically for that socket right there is made specifically for a video card. And that's why you've got, when we look at this motherboard, we've got our video here and our memory here and our CPU here. We've got our little tight spot of Northbridge stuff moving around as tight as it can on the motherboard, with everything else outlined on the Southbridge. Okay, all those other expansion slots, my memory, my hard drive connectors, all that stuff is farther away on the outside of the motherboard. And that's because if it's closer, even though we're talking at millions of cycles per second, it's still going to be faster if it has less distance to go. Okay? So here, what kind of socket is this? This is a LGA. We can tell by the hook, even if we can't see the pins there, because it's still got the cover on it. And it's mainly made for Intel. Okay? So again, I got my back panel connectors. wires, I've got my CPU socket, I've got my memory, I've got my expansion slots, and this one is a PCI
Express
16. This is a,
PCI.
that's a standard PCI right there, and these little tiny baby ones right here are, y'all did motherboard presentations, and those were PCI X1s. Okay,
X1.
X4s are like in the middle, and then an X8 is the same size as a 16. You can't visually look at this and say, this is a 16 and this is an 8. You'd have to look at the specs. In general, if they've got two, very likely they're both 16s. If they have more than two, it's usually like 16, 16, 8, 8. But an 8 and a 16 are the same size. A 4 is half the size of a 16, and a 1 is half the size of a 4. What's a 2? And it's actually right between a 4 and a 1. There is a PCI X2. Almost never see them in motherboards, okay? And by the way, something that goes right here, a PCI X1, will work in a 16, it'll work in an 8, or it'll work in a 4. You can't fit a 4 in a 1, but you can fit a 1 in an 8, or a 1 in a 16, or a 1 in a 4. It will physically fit and it will work, okay? Just so you know, if you're like, I don't have any PCI X1s and I've got this great PCI X1 network card, it'll fit right there. If you look at the little break off, it's exactly the same. See that spot right there? It's exactly the same through all those. And it will fit, and it will work. Okay? So, I need to know what those things are. Because I got little arrows to it, and I say, which one's a PCI? You're going to say, the PCIs are always this cream color. Always. The PCI ones, and I say always with 90% certainty, I'm sure I could find a motherboard that they weren't. PCI ones are almost always this dark brown / black. I don't know, I'm semi-colorblind, call it whatever color you want to, but it's really dark. Okay, the PCI ones are these darker ones. And the PCI X8 and 16s, who knows? They can make them whatever color they want to. Okay, we saw on this one back here, what color was it on this one? Of course, we can't even see Control L. Erase that, all that. Okay, so here, these are white. And look, there we go. See, look, there's a PCI slot. Regular PCI and it's orange. Why? Don't know. Why did they change that one color of that one slot? And there's a PCI one that's white. So see, there are exceptions to every rule. That's an old motherboard. I really should replace that one anyway. Okay? Here's one that's all put together with a couple high-end video cards. They have their own power supplies, and right here, when we looked at motherboards, you may have seen that they were something, they would say something like SLI ready, or Crossfire ready. What that means is that it'll take video cards with the connector. They have to be the right distance apart physically on the motherboard. There's slots. If you go and put this slot way over here and way over here, is that little Crossfire cable that comes with your card gonna reach from there to there? Probably not on this one. Okay? But on this one, that's specifically what this is. There's our Crossfire cable right there that just snaps on the top of them and make those two high-end video cards work as one. And now you got a super duper high-end video card. Okay? You gotta have a really high-end power supply for this system. Okay? Not only do we have a high-end processor with the power supply, we got the normal P1, we got a P4 over here, and we've got two of these 6-pin power connectors that go into each of the video cards. I have a video card at home that takes a 6 and an 8. I have to have 850 watt power supply to even start my PC. My 650 wouldn't do it. But there's the Crossfire. So when you read that, it says it's Crossfire or SLI ready, depends on the video card manufacturer, then that's what it means. That they are physically in the right location, so you could put them next to each other, put that little cable connector on the top, and they would work as one. Okay? Other things that you need to be able to do and talk about when I look at these, okay? I should be able to say, how many SATA connectors can I hook up to this PC? And if I ask you that, how many SATA hard drive connectors can I hook up? 2, 3, or 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I can hook up 6 SATA drives to this motherboard. Okay? SATA drive connectors always come in pairs, so that's 2, 4, 6. It's always going to be an even number. With 95% certainty. I'm sure there's one out there that isn't. Okay? But in general, when I look at a motherboard, so there's the SATA headers right there. They always are in pairs. And frequently it will say something like you have 2 by SATA 6 gigabit and 4 by SATA 3 gigabit. In other words, 2 of them are faster than the other ones. Okay, so when I'm looking at this one, those are different color than these. I will bet you if we went and looked up, if I could read that motherboard, okay, if we went and looked this one up, those and those are different speed connectors. Why, Mr. Poole? Why wouldn't they make them all the same? I don't know. But does the SATA for the hard drive need to be the same speed as the SATA for the CD-ROM?
No.
Absolutely not. CD-ROMs are slow and poop, right? I mean, it's like, you know, you actually hear them starting up. Ooh, those are spinning really fast. This disk is spinning fast. No, it's not. I mean, it's faster than I can spin it with my hand, but it's not spinning as fast as a hard drive. You know, hard drives spin at 5,400 or 7,200 or 10,000 or 15,000 revolutions per minute. They're spinning fast. They can access data really fast. CD-ROMs cannot. So if I'm a motherboard manufacturer, maybe I put 2 of them on there that are slower than the other 4, knowing that you're smart enough to plug your hard drives in here and your CD-ROMs in here. I don't know. That's a conjecture of why some. Yeah, I just locked my computer. That's not what I wanted to do. I wanted to hit Control L to erase Windows out. Okay, let's get back to our discussion. There's our little picture of the SLI card. So we've got different ones, and I told you that ATX is really the one that we're primarily concerned with. We have a lot of BTX motherboards that Dell did in, that's a BTX motherboard. If I held up the motherboard, it wouldn't look a lot different to you. It would look like a mirror of this one. In other words, it would look like this. Okay? It's just the motherboard, same, it looks exactly the same. It's just a BTX mounts on one side and an ATX mounts on the other side. Okay? Dell used a lot of BTX motherboards. So if you actually bought a BTX, it wouldn't fit in an ATX case, but everything else that you got that was ATX would work, just like it was BTX. The case would be the one fact that you would end up running into. Okay, so it's really not, I'm off because I don't want to talk about CPUs. 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 Okay, I'm going to have to break off of this one and pause here for a second. We're going to fall after break when we get more in depth on CPUs. Okay? But I'm going to skip that one slide. So we've got a bunch of different processors out there, and really when we talk about CPUs, I really want to talk about the sockets themselves and the manufacturers. Okay, we already talked about that we've got AMD and we've got Intel as our 2 manufacturers. AMD uses the PGA socket and Intel uses the LGA socket. We'll talk more after break on it, but Intel actually got AMD into the processor manufacturing business because IBM, who was in charge of PCs way back in the day, said, I can't have just one manufacturer of CPUs. And they went to Intel and said, you need to find somebody else to make them with you. Intel hired AMD to make CPUs, and then later on, IBM said, you know what, you're doing a good job. We don't need you to have another company. And then he tried to break the contract, and you sued him for $2 billion, and you paid him $2 billion, and now he's in the CPU market because you got him into it in the first place. He created his own competition. Okay. So AMD, not as well known Makes a good CPU, much less expensive. They don't do advertising. We have a number of AMD processors in the district. Most of ours are Intel. The whole middle school lab is AMD, and many of our servers are AMD servers as well. AMDs run a little faster, are a little hotter, generally speaking. So they require usually a little nicer heat sink on the CPU. Every CPU requires a heat sink. It gets really, really hot, and if it doesn't have a heat sink, it will run slower. Well, it doesn't have a heat sink, it won't run at all. If it doesn't have a good heat sink and the CPU gets too hot, the CPU will slow itself down and eventually turn itself off. In fact, I just made a piece server a couple weeks ago. I didn't have enough thermal grease, which is a gray paste that you put on top of the processor and then the heat sink sits on to make it seal up real good. I didn't have enough thermal paste. I thought, it'll be fine, and it kept shutting down. So I had to order thermal grease, and I had to take it all apart, take it off, and slather a bunch on there, put it back on, and now it doesn't shut down once since I did that. Okay. It's actually our second virtual server, but anyway. So that's a heatsink that would be on there as well, and we have different sizes and manufacture of heat sinks. We already talked about that the CPU has to match the slot on the motherboard, okay? And I'm going to pass this because I really want to go and talk about, and I already mentioned this, the chipset controls the memory and the flow of information around the motherboard to and from the CPU. North Bridge is fast for graphics and memory controller, and the South Bridge does all of our other devices as far as controlling the information around our computer. And it is just a graphic showing that it controls everything that comes back and forth to the CPU. The chipset does that. And I'm going to pass that because I don't really want to talk about flashing the ROM. We've all gone into BIOS at this point, okay? And what this slide, I know I was passing by it. If you've got an unstable motherboard or something that's not working real well, you can upgrade the BIOS to the most current version. And I'll give you an example of when we've had to do that. That AMD lab over in the middle school, we upgraded to Windows 7 this summer. And it upgraded fine, installed Windows 7, and all of them have a gig of RAM in them. And this one would say it had 16 gig, and this one would say it had 1 gig, and this one would say it had 4 gig, and this one would say it had 8 gig, but they all had 1, okay? Because the BIOS wasn't recent enough to handle the upgraded operating system. And so as soon as we upgraded the BIOS to the current version for that motherboard, all of our problems went away, and it works great. So sometimes, if you have an unstable motherboard, going online, finding the BIOS for that motherboard can solve your problem. Like for instance, if I want, we're working on Dell Optiplex 960s right now that we're upgrading, okay? So if I go to Dell Optiplex 960 BIOS, and I end up at the Dell site, and I go to see other versions, because it never takes me to the right version, I see all the different versions of BIOS that have come out. They came out with BIOS version A1 in 2008, and it came out with A18 most recently in 2013. So one of the things that happens as they release new BIOS, they're releasing new BIOSes because of the new hardware that's come out, so that that computer will work with that new hardware. Sometimes what it's done is upgraded the memory that it can work with. So if I go to BIOS version A9 here, we'll go to the description and see what it says it did. Let's see down here. Fixes and enhancements. They upgraded the video BIOS. But if I went through all these, I would see what changes they made. But many times, if your computer isn't working just right the way you want it to, a BIOS upgrade on your motherboard, and that's called flashing the BIOS to the most updated version, can fix your problem. Okay. Now we said it's ROM, it's read-only. That doesn't mean it's never writable. It means it doesn't go away when we remove power, right? It's the difference between ROM and RAM. Okay, so you can upgrade that BIOS. So if you've got a computer that's acting quirky, especially if you've just upgraded something in it, you may just need a newer version of BIOS to handle that newer equipment that you just put in. Okay? And it's just showing you a BIOS site. In the case of this one, it's actually really, this is one of the easiest BIOS upgrades, the Dell BIOS one has, because all I have to do is download this file and I run it straight while I'm in Windows. And it goes and does a reboot and it reprograms the whole BIOS and then it's done. Many BIOSes, you can't do that. Many of them you have to make a Windows DOS disk and reboot to DOS and then run it from DOS, which makes it much quirkier and not as easy. But really anymore, most of the good ones I can run from Windows and then we'll do a reboot. And it will tell me, if I try to download this one and run it on this PC, it would say not the right version and it won't even let you try it, which is good. Because if you flash the wrong BIOS onto a computer, you can pretty much toast the computer if it lets you. Which is the downside of doing it through DOS. Because DOS almost always lets you just try. Okay, I'll write it. And it writes it, and then it goes, I lose, I'm not working. Okay. You also never want to flash BIOS with any kind of bad power, thunderstorm, anything like that going on, because if during the flash process it doesn't get written all the way, sometimes you're just toast, never to be used again. Which is why you'll see some computers say they have dual BIOS, so that if you ruin the one BIOS, it can still boot to the other BIOS to fix the first BIOS. One's writable, one is not. That's what the dual BIOS is for. If you saw that on any of your motherboards. And here's some different BIOS manufacturers, and we've looked at BIOS before back in chapter 1. Okay, we talked about buses in general, and basically what this talk about evolution, we started way back with a 4-bit bus. Okay, it was 4, it was 8, it was 16, it was 32. And now we're up to 64, okay? And one of the problems I'm having right now with software is that we have Windows 95 software that was written for a 16-bit bus. That's how old the software is. And trying to install it on a server that's a 64-bit bus, and no wookie. It's just too old. We talked about what the bus does, controls that flow of information. We don't have to worry about any onboard stuff with the bus like we used to. We used to have to pin out stuff when it came to setting up the bus, but you don't have to do that anymore at all. And you can see the evolution of some of the bus components that really talks about how big and how fast items can go through each thing. And this is the different kinds of expansion slots and things that we have and how fast. And this is old because USB really is way faster than that anymore with USB 3.0. But the speed of the bus controls the speed of everything else that talks on the computer. So if we have a slow bus speed, we have slow devices. Okay? And these are the different kind of expansion slots that we've gone through over time. And really anymore, you guys are just looking at PCI, PCIX1, PCIX8, PCIX16. You don't even know really what an ISA slot is, but they used to have different kinds of slots that we don't even see anymore. This AGP stood for Advanced Graphics Port. That was when the video moved to its own channel with the RAM. When we got the AGP port, that's when the North Bridge split off, and these things talked together, and then everything else talked separately. And even older, I don't even know if I have an older motherboard. We had before that what was called ISA, which stood for Industry Standard Architecture. It was a big, huge, long, black expansion port, which you can see on here. But you're not going to see those anymore. Those are gone to the wayside. Okay. We don't have to set up things with dip switches anymore. Okay. We do still set up and save in CMOS memory through BIOS, right? We still do that, and you guys have done that and changed stuff and saved it in CMOS, like the boot order. Okay, that's the kind of stuff that you guys change. And those are motherboard settings that you guys change in BIOS. Okay, we don't use jumpers. You know what? There's only one jumper I use anymore. There's only one. I will say there's a jumper. There's a jumper on Dell motherboards that say, if I could use right letters, that say PWD. That stands for password. And if that jumper is pulled, it clears the password in BIOS. So when we get these computers from the Air Force, many times they have a password set. I can't change the boot order. I can't turn on a hard drive. I can't do anything. I pull that little jumper right off the motherboard, and now the password's not saved anymore. And I'll show you what I'm talking about. So right here, let's see if we can find. It's already pulled. It's right there. Okay. The jumper right off there. I went, bah, and then it doesn't store the password anymore. And I'm lying. It's right there. See where it says PWD? If you pull that out, it clears the password. I can put it back on later. The password's still clear, but now I can make a new one. But if I pull that jumper off, now I've cleared it so that I can reset the password if I forgot. And that is the only jumper I can think of that I ever set anymore. It used to be a pain. We used to have all these dip switches and jumpers that we had to set on motherboard. What kind of memory you got in? Oh, I'm going to put in DDR2 400, and I got to go and set all the jumpers for that memory. Now motherboards just start up and they go, hey, you got DDR2 400, yay. It's really slow, but I'll go with that, okay? But the BIOS detects it, it just goes. But we used to have to actually set pins and dip switches and jumpers and stuff to make everything work, which is why you needed a computer guy to put in memory. You don't need a computer guy to put in memory. You know, you go boop, you pull it out, and boop, you put it in. You could buy memory at Best Buy and pay them $35 to put in your memory for you. The hardest part of putting in memory is opening the case. I mean, really. Because to put in memory, all I have to do is go like this, I move the little, move those apart, and then I put it there, and I go, good, and I snap it in, and I'm done. And then I wait another 25 minutes before I call you to the desk, because I don't want you to know how easy that was, that I just made $35 from Mr. Hill. You can come and get your computer now, we are done. You go, oh, thanks. Wow, that was worth $35. That guy took a long time, and really he's like, maybe, oh, I've done 20, you know. So, memory is really easy. Okay, we know this too, that battery power for the CMOS battery, that battery holds our settings and our configuration for us. If I pull that battery, then I lose all my configuration stuff. Okay? We should remember from chapter 2, the boot sequence. That's something you need to make sure you have in your notes for the final exam, for the chapter 4 test. Okay, but those beep codes are important, and that is kind of chapter 4, because if I forget to put my memory in my motherboard and I turn on my computer and I start hearing the beeping, the first thing I normally suspect is no. Okay, that's the first thing I normally suspect. The other thing, if it won't start off, is to check the voltage in the power supply. That's chapter 3. Okay, using our power supply checker to make sure it's got the right voltages. Before we go and just assume that the motherboard is bad. So those things, if we've got a bad motherboard or it's not starting, what did the post give us? Did I have beeps? Do I have any error messages? If we just put in something, try putting in something else. In other words, if I just put in memory and it's beeping, maybe it was my memory, okay? And when it comes to memory, and we talked about this briefly, ECC versus non-ECC, error correcting code versus non-error correcting code, the two don't mix, but they look exactly the same and they'll fit in the slot. If I get DDR2 and this takes DDR2 and I put in DDR2 ECC, which is server memory, because it's error correcting code, it may physically fit in there just fine, but it's not going to work and it's going to beep. Okay? Before I go pulling a motherboard, before I pull a CPU, I always test the power supply to make sure that's not my issue. Okay, I'm going to look at some more motherboard pictures before we move on, since we've still got some time, and talk about, let's see if I can, there we go. I wish I could just pull them all up at the same time. Okay, there's there we go. So, a a little graphic of the slots, and you can see how with the PCI 1, the PCI 16, that divider there is exactly the same spot, and you could put a PCI 1 into a 16. You can always tell that it's a 16, or that it's specifically for a video card because it has this lock in the back there. Okay. Let's see if I can undo that. There we go. The lock in the back there, and then we've got our regular PCI slots as well. Here's another graphic showing all the different PCIs. I need one that has. There we go. There's a. That's not an X1. That's an X2 right there, I think. Because obviously that is a 1. There's a 2. You can see it's slightly longer. A 4 is slightly longer than that, and an 8 looks exactly like a 16 as far as that goes. Some of these graphics are ones that I use right on the test, and here's a good one that I may use on the exam. I'm going to load this one up a little bit. Now some of these you're not going to know all of, but let's go through the alphabet and see how many. A through F are kind of hard, although A, if what would you think A is? That one I can tell just from looking at it. You see the little.
It's for like the mouse and keyboard.
Okay. No, that is the sound right there. And usually, if you look from the top of the motherboard down to the bottom, the sound is almost always on the far left of the integrated components, and the mouse and keyboard is almost always on the right of the integrated components. Okay. So what's I? We'll do these ones.
CPU.
Okay. And what kind of socket?
LGA.
For what kind of processor?
Intel.
Intel. That's all we can tell. Okay, you don't know whether it's a 755, a 2010, a 2011, you don't know. But you know it's an LGA, you know it's probably for an Intel. What is G? That's right here.
No, what's like a connector for the hard drive?
Okay, so I got 2 power connectors on every motherboard. Okay.
Oh yeah.
I've got the P1 power connector here, which is how many volts? 3.3 volts. And I have the P4 connector here, which is 12 volts. Okay. Now, older motherboards won't have that, but anymore, every motherboard will have that or a 8-pin one. Okay, some of the AMDs have 8-pin ones there instead of 4. In fact, it almost looks like that's an 8-pin one with a cover plate on one side. Doesn't it look like it goes all the way through there? See what I mean? Like right there? Yeah. Okay, so this right here, just so you know, is a big heat sink that's going around here. And if I look at that whole thing's a heat sink, and these 2 are connected right here. Okay, what do you think this one? What do you think is underneath N?
Chipset.
Okay, and what specifically what chipset do you think is it? That's probably Northbridge. And I'm going to say O is probably the Southbridge, and this is all just to help dissipate heat across my motherboard. Okay, what is J?
PCI. No, memory.
J. Yes, J is our memory. And how many slots do I have?
4.
I have 4. And if I ask you, do you think it's dual channel or not, what would you say?
Yes.
Why?
Color coded.
Because it's color coded. If they were all brown, I would say, no, it's probably not dual channel. Okay? But they color code them on a purpose so that you know that if you've got 2, you put them in the same color together. Why do you think they're split up physically like that?
It's faster.
Faster? Because memory gets hot. And if I'm going to put one in and one in, I want them separated, so that they physically have room to breathe. Okay? Now I know that this one's still close to that one, and yes, if I had done 4, they're still going to be, those 2 are going to be close, and these 2 are going to be close, but it's to give them room to breathe. Okay? What is M?
SATA.
Okay, yes, those are my SATA connectors right there, and I have how many?
4, 8.
6.
Oh,
There's two right there. There's two right there. 1, 2, 3, 4, and then two of a different speed. Always look for another color because oftentimes there is another two that are set, and those may be the faster ones, or maybe the slower ones. Depends on the motherboard. Okay. Any idea what K is over here?
Just
No, not.
okay.
Not when I hide it. You don't know what it is when I have the. Okay, K is a pinned out connector and it's smaller than P. Okay, these both have pins on them. This one specifically has 32 pins, and it is for a floppy. And this one has 40 pins, and it's for a PATA cable. If I look at this one right here, the PATA cable is for the older hard drive connector and older CD-ROM connectors. This has two PATA connectors and one floppy drive connector. Does it even have a single SATA connector? I don't see a single SATA on this one. Okay, so we had two PATAs, and each PATA can connect up two things to it. Okay, so I could connect up 4 things here, and then a floppy drive connector over here. And I'm asking that because when I look at this, and when you look at motherboards, you really should be able to identify from looking at it what all can I connect in here. Now anymore, there's usually only one PATA connector because SATA is so much faster. Why do they still add a PATA connector in there? What might you have that you might want to connect up with your PATA?
A very old computer.
What component might you have that might still work, hook up to PATA just fine?
Hard drive. CD.
It's slow anyway. Why do I need to get a new SATA connector that goes faster than this can read? There's no reason to. Okay? So your hard drive, no, because the SATA goes 3, 6, depending on what speed, times faster than PATA does. But this can't read that fast. It can't write that fast either. So motherboard manufacturers are still leaving many times a PATA connector on the motherboard, and they're leaving a PATA connector on for that DVD that you've got. You can't buy a PATA DVD. I couldn't find it when I was looking last time I bought them. They make little adapters to turn them into PATA stuff. So, because I couldn't find the device, but I still have tons of usage for PATA stuff. So anyways, that's a PATA connector right there. Okay, or an IDE connector right there. It's really hard for me to write with that mouse. Okay, these right here, any guess on what those are for? Those are our front side USB connectors, okay? So when we go and want to connect USB up to the front plugins, there has to be a way to do it, okay? Because it has to connect to the motherboard. So I've got this right here, and then it has a cable running back and plugging in somewhere to the motherboard underneath stuff, because this is a really compressed case right here. But to make that front side USB work, this very well could be our front side sound. Same thing, you have to have a plug into the motherboard for it to have a headphone and mic jack in the front. Okay, and this one here looks like an extra rear USB. If I had more USB that I wanted to plug into the back, I could. So this one looks like it's got a good amount of USB connectors on it. Let's go to another picture, see if I can have a newer one. You know what? Let's do this. Let's go and look for a current one on Newegg. And just pull one right off Newegg. We'll go and grab an AMD motherboard. I'm going to be non-specific, and we're just going to grab this one. Let's see.
I think it's the same one. No, it's not.
That may be way too crappy for us to look at. We have to go in and get a better. Yeah, that's big. I can't do that to this. Let's see if we can go. There we go. And I can't copy these, can I?
No.
Ah, we're done. That's okay. We're doing extra stuff anyway. So next class.